So again, I'm Don Haas, the director of teaching programs at the Paleontological Research Institution and your host for Science in the Virtual Pub. Tonight we'll have Rob OMalley talking about engagement with faith communities. On February 6th, we start our Darwin Days, our annual Darwin Days celebration, and that'll include a Devonian Fishes panel on Science in the Virtual Pub on February 9th. On February 23rd, we'll have Dr. Brenda Young from Damon University talking about the amazing biology of the honeybee. On March 9th, we'll have Bryce Hand talking about ravens and writing desks with reflections on science and science literacy. On March 23rd, we'll have Nick Levine from Ursa Space talking about remote sensing, and yes, we can see that from space. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it off to Rob OMalley to take us into our talk for tonight. And thanks so much for joining us tonight, Rob. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Don. And everyone can see my screen. Give me a thumbs up. Yes, okay. And you can hear me okay. So yeah, thank you, Don, for the invitation, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Rob OMalley. My pronouns are he and him, and I was until recently a project director at the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or Dozer Program, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the publisher of Science Magazine, do a bunch of other things as well. I recently left that program for a new position, and I will mention that program at the end. I did get permission from my AAAS colleagues to speak about the program on their behalf tonight, which I'm very happy and excited to do because I believe really strongly in this work. And I want to just note at the beginning, I appreciate your time and joining us. I do hope we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. And I just want to acknowledge also that these conversations can sometimes take us outside our comfort zones in sort of public engagement with science and faith community engagement, maybe specifically. So I do encourage everyone here to approach this conversation with a mindset of curiosity. And I also want to say that whether you're a person of faith or not, I'm confident that you have company in the room and that you have insights and perspectives that are worth hearing and are worthy to share. And so I hope we'll have a chance to do that. And as we kind of get rolling here, please feel free, some people have introduced themselves already, but please feel free to post in chat if there's maybe particular things you want to share or that you're hoping to learn here tonight. And we'll see, I'll do my best to be able to address or engage with some of that tonight. Okay, slide advanced. Yes. You see a picture of me now? Okay. So a bit about me and my background. I'm an anthropologist and behavioral ecologist by training. And most of my academic work was with the wild chimpanzees at Gombe National Park in Tanzania, which was the site first made famous by Dr. Jane Goodall. I also taught human origins and evolution and primate behavior and ecology for 12 years at 4 institutions across the US as part of my doctoral and then postdoctoral academic career. And while I don't identify as such now, I was raised Catholic, and I was Catholic I shouldn't say most, about half of my life, and most of my family is Catholic or some flavor of Christian. And my father actually attended seminary for many years before deciding not to become a priest, which is lucky for me, obviously. While I identify as an agnostic now, that background really does inform my worldview and how I think about the science and faith intersections, because it was very much a part of sort of my identity for many years of my life. So in 2016, actually just a few weeks after I left Gombe National Park for the last time, in December of 2016, I began work at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the largest multidisciplinary science society in the world. They publish the science family of journals, but also have a whole range of education, policy, and advocacy programs. And the AAAS does all these things because, as it says on the wall behind me, the AAAS mission is advancing science and serving society, which is a big goal. And it acknowledges that science doesn't occur in a vacuum, that Science is something that happens in a society, that science always has a social, cultural, and political context, and it has real impacts on the world. And science often has a lot of lofty rhetoric that surrounds it, including things like, serving people, serving all people, benefiting all of society. And to be honest, in my view, it has often fallen short of that lofty rhetoric. And if we want to be true, or at least more true to that rhetoric, to those ideals, science and its practitioners must be in active dialogue with society at large. So the Dozer Program, or the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, has been an active part of the AAAS since 1995, with the goal of fostering communication and engagement about science between scientific and religious communities, recognizing that these often overlap. And the existence of this program does reflect that understanding that culture, including religion and faith, play a central role in how many people in the US and worldwide frame interests, questions, and concerns about science and technology. The Dozer Program's work are centered on sharing different perspectives about science, identifying areas of common interest and concern, and modeling inclusive discourse among scientists, policymakers, ethicists, religious leaders, and diverse segments of the largely religious US public. We try very hard to walk a line that does not engage directly with theological questions. It's not the place of a major science society such as ours to weigh in on interpretations of scripture or things like that. But that is part of how many people are engaging with science. And so, our role is to basically just make sure in these conversations that science is well represented, and to the best of our understanding, accurately represented, but understanding that this is going to be part of that conversation for many of the people who we're engaging with, and just trying to create some space and conversations for that. So for my time today, I'm going to share some background and best practices that guide our program's work. I'm going to provide a little bit of outline of sort of the two big buckets of activities that the Dozer program is engaged with, or has been engaged with over the last few years. And then I'll note by closing out some resources that are available online, so you can check those out after our time together, and then hope to leave ample time for some discussion. And again, feel free to share in chat if there's particular questions or perspectives or things that you're hoping we might get to, because that can help me weave it in a little bit if I can. So in terms of this background and context for how our program approaches public engagement with science, or specifically engagement with faith communities. First, the idea that scientists just need to give the public the facts, and that they'll think about issues the way scientists do, whether that's issues like vaccines or gene editing or animal testing or anthropogenic climate change. The idea that we just give people the facts and they'll think about things the way scientists do, that the problem with science and the public is that the public just doesn't have the right knowledge, and we're supposed to give it to them and that'll fix things. That's called the deficit model in sort of the science of science communication. And while clear communication of accurate information is definitely important, a growing body of research suggests that simply telling people about science, so working through this deficit model, trying to just let facts speak for themselves, doesn't necessarily have a big impact on public opinion or informal science education. That it's not a very effective approach to getting people interested and engaged and maybe reflective about science. So if we want to have real impactful discourse about science in classrooms, with policymakers, or in our communities, often we have to remember that facts are not enough, as climatologist Katharine Hayhoe often says in her talks. Facts are not always compelling or impactful in engaging people's interests, in changing people's minds about a topic, or encouraging further action. And this is particularly true about politically or socially contested topics. Again, thinking like animal testing, vaccines, anthropogenic climate change, who decides how and what kinds of things are being taught in schools. And so what seems to be more impactful, and the research on this is growing, is an approach of engagement, which is intentional, at least as defined by AAAS, is intentional, meaningful interactions for mutual learning between scientists and the public. So how is this different from sort of a deficit model approach? Well, it includes multi-directional dialogue that incorporates varied perspectives. It explicitly acknowledges and addresses both benefits, limitations, and in some cases harms of science. It involves respecting and listening to issues and concerns that are raised by others, and respecting the public and acknowledging that there are many valuable perspectives on almost any issue, that there are many forms of expertise, and that's part of what should be part of science discourse. So engagement approaches writ large do tend to try to move beyond a one-way communication model into something more collaborative and multidirectional, and often that's something that can lead to action, maybe further dialogue, maybe communal activities, or just setting the stage for independent learning. And with that approach of engagement in mind, my perspective is really that many faith communities are already engaging with the public about science. And many faith communities and faith leaders have real credibility within their communities on critical science and society issues like vaccine hesitancy, health inequality, climate change, addressing conspiracy theories, and ideas about human difference that underlie racism and white supremacy. Faith communities are often well positioned to disseminate information, mobilize volunteers or communities for civic action. So I encourage you to reflect about how, if science engagement is something that's important to you or something you're interested in, thinking about how the work that you want to do or the goals you may have might align with existing community concerns and perhaps ongoing activities. Particularly in the context of the still ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, when health needs are not always being met, particularly for the most vulnerable people, where there has been and continues to be somewhat confusing and sometimes rapidly changing directives about what the science says or what the science recommends people should be doing. It's worth asking, who is showing up? Who is meeting people where they are, providing them with help, empathy, respect, support? And are there ways that we as scientists and educators and science advocates can help? So another sort of big concept or background I want to share is that there is this science of science communication and engagement that I think should guide work in public engagement with science. This includes research on how to communicate science effectively, how people learn science, what people do with science, barriers to learning science and participating in science discourse. And as part of that work, as part of that research, there's a lot of survey work that surveys U.S. public attitudes and perspectives. Most people on the planet, most people in the U.S., in large part signal a lot of respect, enthusiasm, support for science. The idea that science can enrich human lives, enrich human well-being, that is a lot of support. It's also true that most people on Earth, including 7 in 10 US adults, claim some religious identity. And what that means can be complicated, but in addition to valuing science, most people on Earth do claim some religious identity. So if you're engaging with other people on a regular basis, particularly including if you're engaging with people on a regular basis about science, you are certainly engaging with people of faith and religious people. And of course, many scientists are people of faith. By one survey by sociologist Elaine Howard Eklund, it's about 30% of biologists and physicists PhDs claim a religious identity. And this is important in thinking about public engagement, discussing with policymakers in classrooms, and even in discourse with other scientists, because if people are in the room, it's a good idea to assume that faith is too. And while, as I said already, most US adults are generally supportive of science, and most US adults will say they respect scientists as experts in their fields, the same surveys and body of research also suggest that scientists are not viewed as particularly warm or trustworthy. There's a broad perception that scientists tend to be cold, asocial, disinterested in the moral dimensions or real-world impacts on their work. And there's a perception that scientists tend to be hostile or at least indifferent to faith, which again is a central point, a central part of identity of most people. And if the if the values and concerns of scientists are seen as not aligning with the values and concerns of an individual or community, that can have an impact on how they and the science they do are perceived. And that's been known for a long time. As noted by Dan Kahan in sort of summarizing the state of things about 10 years ago, people acquire their scientific knowledge by consulting others who share their values and who they therefore trust and understand. It's much more impactful to hear about forefront science from someone in your community, from someone from your country who maybe speaks your language, than someone who doesn't share some of those markers of identity and background. Because those are signals of identity. Those are signals that someone perhaps shares your background, your values, your identity. Science writ large is a process for generating, disseminating knowledge, but it always has a historical and cultural context. And again, in my view, and I think this is the view that kind of informs a lot of the work that Dozer does, distrust of science and of scientists, and particularly in marginalized communities, communities of color, communities of the disabled, is not an anti-science position. It's a very informed and rational position from a historical perspective. There are many examples of scientists using science in ways that disproportionately harm people and communities. As one common example, the eugenics movement was a mainstream position in the first half of the 1900s, supported by many scientists and the state. There was this famous case, Buck v. Bell, in which the state sterilization of people deemed unfit or undesirable was given legal sanction. There are also examples of science being leveraged against people through, for example, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which should really be the U.S. public health. It should not be the Tuskegee syphilis study. It should be the U.S. public health study, because that's who was doing it. It was the U.S. government, where Black men with syphilis were studied but not treated for decades, which in many cases led to their deaths and the infection and death by syphilis within their families. This history matters because it does impact many communities' perceptions of science and of scientists. But these harmful dynamics are not just history. They're also part of communities' ongoing lived experiences with racism in science and medicine. For example, even as vaccine rates have risen in the US, large racial disparities in cases, hospitalizations, and deaths endure, reflecting inequality of resources, access, and care. So all this is really important in considering how people approach their relationships with science. As a final point about context, everyone has a worldview. I have a worldview, you have a worldview, and we can perhaps think about a metaphor of a house that makes up your worldview, built on your ethics, your cultural norms, your relationships, your personal history. And for many people on Earth, this includes faith or some form of religious identity. And awe, wonder, curiosity, a desire to understand how the natural world works are really central to science and have wide appeal, both driving a lot of scientists, but also generating a lot of interest in science. But whatever their own worldview, if scientists, science communicators, and educators implicitly or explicitly signal that faith, a core component of many people's identity, is not welcome in science or is in opposition to science, that can put people in a position of having to choose between engaging with science and being true to who they are, their communities, their families, their values. So presenting science in a way that directly attacks the foundations of someone's worldview is going to be very threatening and can provoke strong emotions. And that's true of anybody. That's not just true for people of faith. And people are often highly motivated to sort of rationalize away information that challenges beliefs or accept information that reinforces them. Again, this is true of everybody. This is not just about faith communities. And people tend to respond poorly to being insulted or being told that they are wrong, or being told, that what they think is wrong and why they need to change. And that's, again, true of everyone. So a better approach, informed by what the research suggests is actually effective, is to strive to meet people where they are, to not bring a hammer in this metaphor, this somewhat tortured metaphor now, bring a ladder, Give people space and opportunity to affirm their values and identity, to reflect on new information, express curiosity, identify their own interest in science and how it fits into their worldview. Set the stage for future independent learning. Because what people think isn't something that you're ever going to decide for them. So, with all that in mind, some general best practices that guide our program's work. First, that we advocate for others to keep in mind as well. First, be strategic, be intentional about your objectives for particular audiences and contexts. Recognize that engagement is an iterative process, that there's no universal script. Start with communities you may be already a part of or have some connection to, and focus on what's feasible and what you enjoy doing. Be mindful of your time and energy. Second, be respectful. That doesn't mean you have to agree on everything. In fact, it's particularly important when you don't agree. Approach others with cultural humility, which means striving for curiosity rather than judgment. Seek to affirm the dignity of others as people and try to be part of the dialogue. Give others the chance to be heard. Meet people where they are. And finally, be human. Science is a process and something that people do. It always has a historical and cultural context. Remember that storytelling is powerful. Awe, wonder, and curiosity have wide appeal and can be really valuable in science engagement contexts. Look for common ground to build upon, and often that involves considering identity and culture. And remember that it's generally more constructive to build on shared values rather than shared beliefs. So how does our program sort of embody this in the work that we do? Well, we lead or serve as a consultant for several projects within the broader theme of science and theological education. And we do this work because faith leaders are often consulted by members of their communities on forefront issues, including science issues, topics related to public health or conservation or artificial intelligence. But many faith leaders don't necessarily have a deep background in science and technology topics. So accordingly, our program has sought to engage collaboratively with faith leaders and institutions to better equip forefront and existing religious leaders to participate in science and society discourse. The largest of these projects, Science for Seminaries, has been running since 2013. Seminaries, primarily but not exclusively Christian seminaries, receive grants to support integration of science content into core courses and to host science events at their institution. They're paired with external science advisors with expertise on the particular science topics they're seeking to engage with. And they have plenty of opportunities to engage with us, to engage with scientists, including their advisors, but also other scientists. They're able to send representatives to the AAAS annual meeting, which is a big science event that happens every year. And the impact of this has been quite large. There's been 42 seminaries involved in this program, over 120 faculty directly involved, 200 courses have been modified to include more science content. It's reached over 5,000 students and has led to over 130 campus events and counting. And I did have an opportunity to participate in one of these myself through a presentation on my research, my academic research at Mundelein Seminary a number of years ago. So engaging directly with faith institutions on science topics that they're interested in and equipping future religious leaders and religious institutions to engage with science. A smaller project, continuing education for pastors, was in a very similar vein, but was focused on existing pastors as a form of professional development. So there was a series of co-created events and public programming at 4 seminaries on topics like mental health and awe and wonder in science. And then finally, we're a consultant on a project called Scientists in Synagogues with a Jewish culture-focused organization called Sinai and Synapses, run by Rabbi Jeff Middleman, which seeks to foster discourse about science and Judaism and the role of science in public life in partnership with synagogues and rabbinical networks. And they do a lot of both in-person and increasingly virtual programming. The other Dozer activities, and this was the bucket of Dozer activities that I tended to be more directly involved in, falls within the broad umbrella of supporting scientists and science communicators and educators in engagement with the broadly religious public. And we call this broad bucket of activities engaging scientists and faith communities. So this has involved developing and disseminating toolkits and other resources for inclusive science engagement, including interactive science communication training, providing platforms for individuals and programs to share about faith community engagement work that's already happening in different scientific fields and with diverse communities, and creating events that model religiously inclusive engagement. Again, really trying to be true to those best practices that I shared earlier, that are really central to what the science says is the most impactful, most effective approach to public engagement with science. This has included interactive workshop module called Science Engagement with People of Faith. And since 2017, over 1,200 participants, primarily scientists or students in STEM fields, have taken part in this workshop at universities, at science society meetings, and science communication conferences. It's been very well received. We usually get about 90% of people saying they would recommend it to a colleague. We've done some follow-up evaluations on this workshop, suggesting that sort of the key takeaways stay with people, that 6 to 12 months later, they can talk about the impact that workshop has had on their teaching approaches, their public engagement work. So we're tremendously proud of the impact that these have had.
Rob, are these workshops still being offered?
Yes, but it's somewhat more sporadically, and it tends to be virtual. And now that I've left the program, they're going to have to kind of adjust who's doing it and how often, but there's every intent that they will continue.
Great.
We've created resources, including a primer on public engagement with science, which is called Scientists in Civic Life, which is really meant to be, at least as of 2018, sort of an overview of dialogue-focused engagement, public engagement with science approaches, and why it's effective and why it's important. We've created a 4-part video series summarizing some best practices, again, kind of in line with what I mentioned earlier, that scientists and science communicators can draw upon. And we have a profile series with 24 profiles and counting of different scientists discussing faith community engagement in their own words. And we select people to run these profiles who we believe really embody those best practices of being strategic, being respectful, and being human. And these are scientists who are working in all different communities on a whole range of science topics: conservation, climate change, astronomy, biological anthropology, mathematics, evolution education. Sometimes these are scientists of faith, sometimes they are not, but all of them are really showing how this can be done in real world settings in different fields, and some of their reflections on that work. And so we think it's just tremendously valuable. We've run webinars similar to what I'm doing right now, which are, intended to sort of fly the flag for the program and sort of highlight what we see as best practices. We've also done events to sort of model what inclusive dialogue about science topics can look like. As one example, at Inclusive SciComm almost 2 years ago now, we hosted a panel discussion on faith community perspectives on conservation and environmental justice, where we had 4 religious leaders, 3 of whom also had some background in science or scientific research, talking about what they saw as the intersections. So it was a panel about science, but it was primarily centered on faith perspectives about science. But it was also informed faith perspectives because these were people with, in some cases, formal scientific training. We've had a number of university events in 2018 and 2019. We had 6 university events at 6 university campuses. In each case, the topics were co-developed with those institutions on a whole range of topics: conservation, human origins, honoring indigenous culture, identity, and worldview. And many of these events, again, in line with sort of what we see as our mission, include perspectives of non-scientists, including ethicists, faith leaders, activists, sharing their views on science and society issues, along with forefront science perspectives. We've had a number of events at scientific societies, including the Society for Neuroscience, American Geophysical Union, American Astronomical Society, American Association of Physical Anthropologists, now Biological Anthropologists, as well as the AAAS meeting. So these have included poster symposia, highlighting work that's been happening in that field already related to faith engagement, pulling together speakers to talk about their work or different elements of this work, as we did at the AABA meeting. And otherwise just sort of highlighting that this work is already happening, is already having impacts in different fields, and that there are models out there to reflect on, to learn about, and perhaps apply to future work. Yeah, I saw Brianna spoke in Science in the Pub in the fall. Yeah, Brianna is fantastic. And if you have not checked out the Smithsonian Human Origins program, they have some fantastic resources related to education on human origins and education on teaching evolution using human examples, things like that.
We also hosted or co-hosted that traveling exhibit with the library at Tompkins.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And if you want to check out Brianna's Talking Science in the Virtual Pub, the recording is up there. It's great.
Excellent. Yeah, that whole program I think is really a gold standard for what publicly engaged science can look like. So, okay, and then we also have an annual event each December. We now call this December Dialogues on some forefront science and society issue. So recent topics have included human diversity, climate change, science, ethics, and faith, and science fiction, where we had the Vatican astronomer, Brother Guy Consolmagno, and Nnedi Okorafor, who's a fantastic science fiction author, talking about how science, ethics, and faith show up in science fiction work, and which is a really cool conversation. This year, and this was actually my last event at Dozer, so I'm very proud of it, we had a conversation on sex, gender, and identity, sharing both scientific perspectives from anthropology, and also perspectives from within faith community circles about celebrating the diversity of human experience as it relates to gender, what can be challenging about these conversations, how these conversations can be productive and helpful and affirming. So I'm tremendously proud of that, and that event, the recording of that event, will be out hopefully in the next few weeks. And then we've also been working in community and citizen science. An astronomer, Grace Wolfe Chase, for a number of years was working with the Zooniverse platform when she was at the time at Adler Planetarium, basically seeking to use the Zooniverse platform, which is a platform to connect the public with opportunities to be involved in different research topics. Dr. Wolfe Chase was interested in involving faith communities in that work. So we supported that work, and it was somewhat disrupted by COVID, but we were able to sort of get some explore how that could work, some challenges in involving faith communities in this type of citizen science programming, and I'm hopeful that something like this will continue in the years to come. And I think some big takeaways from all this is that engagement is already happening, as I said at the beginning of the talk. It's can be very impactful, it can be very productive, it can be a fantastic experience for everyone involved. For scientists and science communicators who identify as people of faith, acknowledging that element of their identity can be a really powerful way to sort of change the tenor of the conversation, lower the temperature a bit about some perceptions of who does science and who's welcome in science and who doesn't. For scientists who are not people of faith, it's important to be sincere, but being willingness to sort of acknowledge that this is in the room, that this is part of people's lived identity, that your culture and your values and including your faith perspectives is not something you have to leave at the door of the lab to enter science spaces, can be really powerful, again, for sort of changing the tenor and the richness of conversations about science and society issues. Again, all really within this rubric of meeting people where they are and honoring people for who they are. And there are lots of networks and models and individuals to learn from in this space. You should not feel you have to start from square one if this is something you're interested in, but you want to get started. I think the Dozer program is a wonderful place to start. We have this resource website, sciencereligion.dialogue.org, that has a lot of our resources, reports on different projects we've done, all the profiles that I've mentioned. There's also other networks and organizations out there that are doing this work. We mentioned Brianna Pobner and the Human Origins program at the Smithsonian. I think that's a fantastic program related to human origins. There's networks like the Clergy Letter Project, groups like National Center for Science Education that do a lot of really robust engagement, thoughtful engagement about these topics, including with faith communities. So I think that there's still a lot of work to do, but I think that it's a really rich space to be thinking about, as you know, in this current moment where there's a lot of discourse about science and society and distrust of science and things like that. What kind of impacts can be had if scientists and science communicators are engaging constructively with faith communities as part of their work. And I just want to close with just a shout out. So I have, as of a few weeks ago, I've left the Dozer program to take a new position. My new position is with a project at Harvard Medical School called the Personal Genetics Education Project, or PGED, which is a public engagement program that is focused specifically on personal genetics and societal discourse about genetics, the impact that it will have on people's lives. There's a lot of resources for educators, but they also do, or we, I should say, also do engagement with policymakers, with the entertainment industry, and with faith communities. So I encourage you to check that out as well, if that's a topic of particular interest to you. And with that, I will say thank you so much for the opportunity to share a bit, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation.
We will open it up for questions. You've got questions, you can either use the raise your hand function or put it into the chat. And that was great. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah.
And Mike's got a question.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a question / comment, which is one of the things that I've learned in the classroom. I teach at a community college, and when we discuss evolution, a lot of students are not aware of really where their religious sect stands on evolution, which is kind of interesting. And that's a question I always ask in class, because a lot of students in my area are Catholic, and the Catholic Church is fine with evolution. And those Catholic students think, no, that's bad. We can't believe in that, because the really loud voices on that topic are not coming out of a lot of the various the religious sects that are fine with it. They're coming out of folks who don't like it. And so then other people just get the impression, oh, well, if they're saying it's bad and Christianity disagrees with it, then that must apply to me, even though it doesn't apply to them. Because even if you're a Lutheran, the Missouri Synod, very conservative, young earth, no evolution. Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, just the opposite, old earth, evolution, no problem. And it's really an interesting conversation to have with people, because a lot of times they don't even know where their religion stands on some of these issues.
Yeah, and I thank you for sharing that reflection, Mike. I think that's very true. That definitely aligns with my own experience as well. And that's in fact, and maybe Don, if you could find the Clergy Letter Project link and put that in chat, if you search for like Clergy Letter Project. So I think that does reflect that, yeah, that the loudest voices are often not the representative voices. I think it also reflects this sort of broader cultural narrative that you either value one or the other, which is, I think, I personally feel is for most people false. I think that you can value both. And people are sort of picking up on that cultural cue. It's like, well, if you're a person of faith, then you obviously can't be part of, evolutionary science or engaging with evolutionary science. And I think the way to address that, or one way to address that, is to be really mindful about, how we frame these things in classrooms. And, Brianna, among others, has talked about that like, recognizing that there's this whole spectrum of views on how these, how faith and science can intersect or not, for some people, highlighting that there are excellent scientists of faith, including some that are, like, for example, on the board of National Center for Science Education, who are very devout scientists, including Catholic scientists, and that's great. And they, and they write books about their work. And I'll also say that one of the things that I really took from my time at Dozer, which I will always be grateful for, is really rich conversations with people from very conservative theologians, from very conservative faith communities, who, as long as it was understood that we're having a conversation, I'm not trying to like win them over on like evolutionary theory or whatever. And again, like my PhD is in evolutionary biology, so this matters a lot to me. As long as it's understood that we're having a conversation, they're very happy to have absolutely fantastic, rich, enjoyable conversations where I learn a lot and they learn something and we talk it out, and it's okay. And like, of course I would prefer that evolution acceptance was at 95% or whatever in the US. Like, that would be awesome. But like, it's also good to like have good conversations with people and talk about how people understand the world and how that differs from how I understand the world, and feeling like they could ask me questions about human origins and chimpanzees or whatever, and it was fine. Like, there's value in that. And I appreciate that, like, classrooms are a different context, and often there's like legal parameters you got to work within, but like we don't really do the challenges any good by pretending they're not there. And there are ways to sort of navigate these challenges, navigate these conversations in ways that is constructive, evidence-based, and leads to good outcomes. And Ingrid, I see, has a question.
Yeah, I saw a lecture once about science and art, and the lecturer contrasted a view of science as that science is perceived as helpful, but also harmful. And you gave some examples of where science has harmed people, and you can think of many others. And a view that science should be held accountable for that harm, versus art, where there are often arguments that artists should have complete freedom to create their art, even if it harms people. And an example is there was a famous piece of art. There was a toilet with a crucifix in it, covered in urine, right? And that was very hurtful to a lot of Christians, but that artist was defended by a lot of people. And I don't know what, you might be on different sides of that debate, but and I wonder if there's a similar contrast between science and religion. And I wonder if some scientists might be more comfortable talking with people of faith if there was more acknowledgement that religion can also harm, just like science can, and religion is not perfect. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, as someone who was Catholic for half my life and who has many family members who are practicing Catholics, I think that, and reading any newspaper these days about challenges that different faith communities are engaging with in terms of, leadership issues and issues of racism and sexism and assault and all kinds of terrible behavior. I think that it is it's good to have accountability. I think that creating space for people in communities to be accountable is good. I think requests for accountability from outside communities is often challenging. And I think that that's true for faith communities. I think that's true of universities. It's true of scientific organizations. It's a really thorny issue. This is maybe a somewhat rambling answer. I'll say, I think accountability is good. I think the reason that accountability is hard is because, it requires a reckoning, and it requires acknowledgement of harm, and it requires redress. I mean, American Society of Human Genetics, some people may have seen. American Society of Human Genetics is this big science organization focused on human genetics and its relation to human health. They had a report released 2 days ago acknowledging that their field and their institution, this organization, has been very complicit in eugenics, in the propagation of racist ideas, being silent in the face of extremely harmful activities that had sort of the mantle of science around them that are still, have repercussions today. So it is possible. I think it's always good for institutions, organizations to be open to that. When it comes from outside, sometimes that's necessary, but that can be really hard. The looking for shared values can maybe encompass things like accountability. That can be one of the things maybe that in a somewhat perverse way can be a shared interest.
Yeah, and I was thinking, so maybe not so much just accountability, but also that, like you mentioned, that people of faith might be afraid to talk to scientists because they're afraid of how scientists would view them. And I think it might be the other way too, that the scientists might be afraid to talk to a faith community because religion is so revered in our society. But maybe that mutual acknowledgement of we're both a little bit afraid to talk with each other, maybe.
Yeah. And I think, so a point that Catherine Hayhoe, a climatologist and also a evangelical Christian, often says is, you're often best looking for ways to engage where you already are. Like if you're not a person of faith, but you're in a bike club, engage with your bike club, and if you go to church if you go to a Catholic church, you go to an evangelical church, you're known there. And so maybe there's an opportunity for you to engage there. But like engaging with communities you're not a part of, it's certainly possible and doable and can be really impactful, but that's not necessarily the best, most effective route to take. And one of the roles I think for scientists who kind of want to support this type of engagement can be being really mindful about, their positionality, and like, are there other scientists that they can direct people towards, or that they can involve in conversations they want to have that can serve a bridging role, or that maybe have more in common with particular communities. So that can also be part of these processes of engagement, knowing when that we are maybe not the best voices.
Yeah, I'll note that I grew up Presbyterian and have not been a person of faith for a long time, but I did a few years ago speak in my old church, and it was great fun, seeing all these friends of my parents and things like that. So if you've got those connections, I think my mom sort of set that up. So that means that it was several years ago now, but it was a lot of fun, and it was actually 3 churches together. So not just my church, but the local Presbyterian churches do a Saturday session on whatever, and 3 churches get together to do that. So if you've got those connections, take them.
Yeah, and I'll just add, one of the most powerful things we can do as like advocates for science is think about how we can engage in science in unexpected places. Again, part of that whole meet people where they are mindset. It's great to give a lecture at 7 p.m. on your college campus on frog genetics, but the people who attend a 7 p.m. lecture on frog genetics on the university campus are already in the tank for frog genetics, pardon the pun, right? They're already on board. They're already interested. They're already on the university campus. Like that's not a place where everybody's going to show up. But like if you could talk about your research at a farmer's market or a church or your local high school or the local stream cleanup, that's so much more impactful, but the potentially so much more impactful in terms of reaching new audiences than doing something on a university campus. And the university campus thing is fine, But like if part of our challenge or if part of what we're called to do is engage with new people, engage with more people, be really mindful of that kind of element, is meeting people where they are already.
Yeah, I might go ahead and I'll ask.
Yeah, I was going to say a really good example of that is people love fossils. So if there's a local fossil outcrop and you can lead a group of people to just look at those fossils and look at the layers of rock that those fossils are coming out of, you know, and get them to think about what does that actually mean? You know, if I'm finding marine shells in the middle of Illinois, 1,000 miles away from any ocean, what does that mean? And that really kind of engages people and makes them think, and brings up some wonderful and fun conversations.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, and I'll note Brendan's got his hand up, and I'll note that Mike and Brendan serve on the National Association of Geoscience Teachers Advocacy Committee along with me, and they are working on rewriting the evolution position statement for NAGT. So
great.
Bit of background there. Brendan, go ahead.
Hi. So I'm Brendan, like Don just said, and so I'm currently a postdoc at PRI, but my previous postdoc was at Baylor, and I've been doing some research there that's about kind of that university setting, but it being a kind of new place and a new environment for a lot of people. So yes, you've got them in the classroom, but they're not the frog genetics lecture group. They're just the we are attending university group. And from your like broader national experience, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on those religious affiliated institutions, both university and private high school, etc., and what you've seen work well and what you've seen work not as well, preferably more of the former.
I think it's very understandable, but often not very productive in the conversation, in the context of what we're talking about today, to kind of say, this is a science classroom, we're not talking about this other stuff. I think that's just generally, I understand why that happens. I think both the evidence and, you know, the research and also people's lived experience, including mine, suggest that that's just not effective, because it's in the room and you're signaling that it's taboo, you're signaling this is something we're not dealing with here, when it's very, very important to the actual subject and how people are going to engage with the subject. So then what becomes more effective? I think highlighting that these are complicated issues. I think talking about science, and this is all like, this is what the science education research says, you know, science as process, science as something that has a history. You know, you can learn about Darwin, you can learn about, you know, Huxley, and you can learn about all these, you know, people who you know, developed this theory. You can learn about, you know, ideas of evolutionary thought that were present in Islamic communities long before Darwin. You can talk, you know, like there are ways to sort of weave in the humanity. You can talk about, you know, the church's often complicated relationship with science. I mean, there's like the whole Galileo thing, which is often, I'll just say as a sidebar, is often misunderstood. And, you know, it's really about politics and not so much about science versus religion. You know, you can talk about these really fascinating intersections. You know, Robert Fitzroy, who was the captain of the Beagle, who's like often portrayed as the foil of Darwin and like the story of Darwin's legacy. Fitzroy was a scientist. Fitzroy was a founder of meteorology, but he was also a Christian, and that was a very important element of his identity. And like how he kind of navigated these things was very different from the path that Darwin was on. But these were both men who were very invested in science and understanding how the natural world works. And just kind of weaving in that humanity is both A, true, and B, actually gives people chances to understand science in context, the complexity of science, and that, you know, science as a something that we are creating as people. It's not just facts. And then the other component, I think, is just being very mindful about sort of who you highlight. as like voices of science. There are many scientists of faith who talk about being scientists and being religious. I think even if all you do is just show them or like have a quote from them or have people read something that they wrote, I think that that also helps open up space for like, this is a place where people of faith are welcome and are being successful and are making important contributions. One of our profilees in the Dozer Program's profile series, Fatima Jackson, is a practicing Muslim. She wears hijab. She is a forefront leader in biological anthropology. She is a leader in this field. And part of her identity is being a fantastic scientist, but also being a person of faith and very publicly being a person of faith. And so these are just ways to sort of highlight, these don't have to be conflicting, elements of identity. For some people they are, and they will be. And I also want to respect that as well. I mean, I'm agnostic, again, pardon the pun, about whether, one of these approaches is better or not. But it is possible. It doesn't have to be a source of conflict. It doesn't have to be something where people are choosing one or the other.
Other questions? Bryce?
Yeah, is that the raised hand method, or is there something I'm supposed to punch or push? Or
That's fine.
Okay. Hi, thanks, Rob. My late friend, Stephen J. Gould, the paleontologist at Harvard, championed the view that of two non-overlapping magisteria. And basically that amounted to religion and science don't overlap. They're not in conflict because they don't overlap. Unfortunately, he was wrong. They do overlap. Where this is most evident and most disturbing and unfortunate is where religionists impose on science. Again, you can see this currently in vaccines. In other words, they are not separate. I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
I think, yeah, I mean, I will say that for a lot of my life, I that was my view, like this idea that it's non-overlapping magisteria. And I agree that it's unsatisfying. I find it unsatisfying now to kind of take that approach. I would also say that like something I've come to appreciate in my work at when I was working at Dozer was that mindset appeals to a lot of scientists, that these are, non-overlapping, we can respect both, they don't overlap. That is very much not something that a lot of people of faith, typically more conservative people in the more conservative spectrum of faith perspectives, they really want a more integrated view of how the world works. And the idea that these are two separate things does not appeal. And some of the resources that the Human Origins program at the Smithsonian has created tackle a little bit of that question, that there are kind of these different frameworks and that they're not going to work for everybody. I think that an important element, I didn't get into this here, but I get into it in our workshops. A lot of the work that what Dozer does is with self-selected communities and individuals. We are not chasing down groups necessarily to be like, please engage with us, please work with us. I think that what this program has strived to do is sort of embrace a model of pluralism, and we try to embody that. We're trying to create a fairly neutral, low temperature space, a space for reflection and discussion around and acknowledging that these are really can be challenging issues. That approach is not going to reach everyone. That approach is not going to. There are some communities that are not interested in that. I don't know how to solve that problem, but I would say that there's a broader question of sort of how we direct our energy and finite resources, and in like climate in climate change context, like the research shows that there's this whole spectrum of beliefs, and there's like this small section of people that are just kind of not going to be persuadable. And it just makes sense in the climate context to focus on the rest, right? The people that have questions, have doubts, are uncertain, but that are willing to kind of engage with these issues in good faith. And I think in the case of science and religion as well, there are lots of people who would really love, and I think it would be very impactful to engage with, who scientists, science advocates, and educators are not necessarily reaching. That doesn't mean I think that we should necessarily focus on the most challenging, most difficult people right off the bat. I think that we have to be strategic about how we are focusing our time and energies. I mean, I also think that, we have to, in this space, I think we have to stand up for humanity as well. I'm a giant white guy with a PhD. Like, I don't face the kind of pushback necessarily that women scientists do, or that scientists of colors do. I'm cisgendered man. I don't face the kind of pushback or prejudice that that members of the trans community do. People should not be asked to sort of debate their humanity. And I think that in public engagement spaces, as in other spaces, we have a responsibility to defend humanity, and sometimes that means we're not going to be successful at public engagement. But I think there's a deeper value at work that we have to support. That's, again, maybe a more long-winded answer than you were looking for, but is maybe an important note to close on.
Most of the time, most people, whether they're religious or not, well, no, if they're religious, that's the people I'm talking about now, they're not behaving, their day-to-day activities don't have much to do with their religious beliefs. They may profess to be faithful Catholics or Protestants or whatever, but in their day-to-day activities, really, when you look around at them and what they're doing, there's not very much time, and not much of the time they're doing anything that isn't just part of our normal local culture. That they're not being guided by the principles of their religion. Once upon a time, that probably wasn't so. The religion was much more important because you didn't have an alternative. And I think religion, basically, I'm hopeful, it's simply becoming less important in society. And more people, of course, I mean, more and more are unaffiliated. As you say, 70% or maybe profess some religiosity, but that means 30% don't. And I'm at the top of that 30%.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some broader societal trends shifting away from formal religious affiliation. But I think that, and there's also very real prejudice against people self-identifying as agnostics and atheists, which is interesting. Like, even, I think there's some research, I believe there's research suggesting that atheists don't trust atheists. Atheists rank people of faith more trustworthy than they do fellow atheists, things like that. Really interesting, like, social science dynamics there. Yeah, I mean, I guess my personal view is, like, I think that people have agency to make these choices themselves. And my training is in part as an anthropologist, and I see religion as adding a lot of value and richness to the human experience, but I also very much recognize that there are some real harms and problems that certain religious identities and ideas have inflicted on the world. That's also true of science. And I try to focus in my work and in my personal life on the shared values rather than shared beliefs. Like,
I'm trying to think of an example where science has done harm. People do the way they use what the knowledge that science provides have done lots of harm, but that's not the science. Knowledge, in other words, I don't see that as, I'd like an example where science has been harmful. Plenty of examples where religion has been harmful, but
So so a distinction between the ideas, separating the ideas from the people who are doing it.
yeah, well, I mean, for crying out loud, Hitler's activities were awful, and but that wasn't scientific knowledge. That was interaction between humans, and those are social problems. People aren't very good at getting along with one another. Of course,
I realize we're well over time now. I guess I would just question whether those things can ever be fully separated. I mean, I think the Nazis would be the first to say that they were following the science as they understood it, and I would also note that Hitler and the Nazis were following American eugenicist ideas, and we know that because that's what they said.
Yeah, I was going to bring up eugenics. There was a push by many scientists to do research into that, and to try to figure out, can we breed better humans? Can we do selective breeding? And there was definitely lots of scientists involved in that, and thought that they were doing science. They thought, now that we know this, how do we apply this information on selection, and can we apply what we know about selection to people?
My point is that how you use scientific knowledge is not the same as the worth of science itself. Knowledge is knowledge, and how you use it as a separate thing. How you use it is not science.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. I think I just struggle with having those things completely separate. That does knowledge exist outside of how people use it? I have to ponder that a bit more.
Yeah, I don't think it does. I think it's pretty hard to separate scientists from science. And we can try that, but
it's a great question, right? And I think that that is an interesting philosophical question. Like, does it exist? Does it exist a part of outside of our heads?
Should we do this research? I mean, I think that question comes up a lot in science ethics. And, we look back and we think maybe there's some research that was ill-advised.
Yeah. Who knows where AI will take us, for example. Interesting thought.
Well, I also think that's different from the science itself. I mean, we can look out at the universe and we can try to determine how stars form and those kinds of things. And from that, we can eventually deduce fusion and fission. But that doesn't make the science itself, the fact that the stars exist and that fusion and fission go on, that doesn't make that evil. It's the use that people put to it that can determine whether it's evil or not, in my opinion.
I think a really good thing to think about is, as scientists, we recognize that some of our research has been maybe not the best thing to do, and that's why we now have boards at universities that review research proposals to decide whether or not it is ethical and worth pursuing. So IRBs are really commonplace now. They weren't a long time ago. And I think one of the reasons that we have IRBs is because people recognized that some of the research that was being done was probably not ethical.
Yeah, and Ted Kaczynski was a research subject, which may have had some influence on how he turned out, for example.
So I don't know, I guess I don't think that facts about the universe have moral character, but the pursuit and project of science that is done by human persons how you choose to set up experiments, what you choose to pursue, what policies you promote as scientific, that all have impact on people, and historically tend to be impacts on people who don't look like me as a cishet white man. Like, if at all stages, from what question you ask, how you perform the experiment, why you're performing the experiment, how you implement the results in society, if all of those factors can be harmful, how is it that different than anybody writing off anything that anyone in any religion has ever done by saying, oh, well, like the thought or the thing that I wrote down doesn't actually do any harm, just people do harm. I think that there is some level of equivalency there of, you know, the facts of nature don't have moral character, but that itself is a philosophical, religious perspective, that those things don't have moral character, which I don't want to elaborate too much on that. But like, my undergraduate background was in philosophy of religion, so I find it really potentially problematic to say this is science and it is pure and good.
Yeah.
And that religion over there, that leads to harm. But what I did in asking questions, constructing questions, performing experiments, using the results, and producing physical, tangible products, all of that is exempt because that's not really science. Science is just the facts.
Yeah, maybe another way of saying that is saying that science doesn't do any harm, but scientists do. I think you could say pretty much the exact same thing about religion. The Bible doesn't do any harm. It's people interpreting the Bible and doing things with it that does the harm. That's kind of parallel, right?
Yeah, I mean, if one were to take the view, and I'm not endorsing this either way, but
Yeah.
one takes the view that it's, you know, it's a product of culture and history, and, you know, it's a cultural artifact, and it's a work of literature that emerged in a particular time and place, and has this whole long, fascinating history. Like, it just is. It's, you know, it's writing that people have written. You know, is that, you know, that scripture is not the same as lived religion, which is not the same as theology, which is not the same as how people are actually living their lives as Christians. And, you know, that